Hi, everybody. Today's video lecture is on Canadian trade actors. Let me pull up the slides here. Alrighty. So there's multiple actors that are involved in Canadian trade policy, some more important than others, some that deal with agenda making, others that look at ratification, decision making, implementation, evaluation, right across the whole policy spectrum. We'll begin with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister initiates the policy. They appoint the negotiators. They conduct high-level negotiations, such as in the Canada-US agreement, the renegotiation of NAFTA, or the renegotiation of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Global Affairs Canada, where the Trade Minister is, as well as the Foreign Minister, negotiates the policy. And as well, we've got trade offices and embassies around the world, and much of what they do is promoting trade with Canada. Parliament legalizes policy. All major agreements have to be ratified in Parliament. This is usually straightforward in a majority government situation, although there was a major exception involving the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement in the 1980s, but it can become more complicated in a minority government situation. Export Development Canada and the Canadian Commercial Corporation are trade promotion agencies. They're both Crown corporations, and they deal with different aspects of helping Canadian companies sell their products in other countries. The Department of Finance sets up tariff policy, many of the domestic regulations involving trade into Canada. And the Canadian International Trade Tribunal is a quasi-judicial body that deals with court challenges that companies will offer against tariffs. The provinces have a constitutional role in trade, and I'll go into that in more detail later on in this video. They're consulted on the major trade agreements, and they do their own trade promotion, as we will see. And then there's a whole host of societal groups. These could be business groups. These could be non-governmental organizations. We can look at the role that public opinion plays, both in setting up parameters around trade policy, consultation around trade policy, and especially the implementation of trade policy. So this is a bare bones sketch of the major actors. Now we'll go into a bit more detail on all of them. Now, in the early years, Canadian policy was developed and handled quite apart from the rest of Canadian society. There wasn't a lot of concern with what we were doing, and so representatives, Canadian bureaucrats would meet in Geneva and other places to negotiate trade, and it dominated trade policy. Trade officials negotiated the details through GATT, and there wasn't a lot of news coverage. The provinces weren't involved. Other politicians or NGOs didn't seem to care much about trade policy. Cabinet made the agenda, and it approved agreements, and they were implemented through orders in council. Oops. Things started to change as things got more complicated, and a good way of viewing this is the role that Parliament plays. Parliament is a forum for debate around trade promotion, negotiations, agreements, and unlike the old order in council, have to pass any agreement because it involves changes to Canada's legal system. As I mentioned at the beginning, usually in a majority situation, that's pretty straightforward. But notably, in 1987, the Senate, which was dominated by the Liberal Party, refused to pass the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement that had been negotiated by Mulroney's Progressive Conservative government. It easily passed the House because Mulroney had a majority government, but the Senate delayed, and this forced an election, and the 1988 election was held largely on the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and that is why I'll do a separate video just on that case study. Now, the Prime Minister is a very influential role in foreign policy, but also in trade policy. Now, most of you are too young to remember this. If you want, I've got the YouTube link in here. This was the Shamrock Summit of 1985. And it was called the Shamrock Summit because both President Reagan and Prime Minister Mulroney had Irish backgrounds. It occurred over St. Patrick's Day in March of 1985, and it climaxed with Reagan and Mulroney and their wives at a gala event, and them coming on stage singing "When Irish Eyes Are Smiling." And you can criticize or you can praise Mulroney's politics all you want, but I can tell you he's got a great baritone voice and knows how to sing. So if you want, you can turn on that video. The reason that video is important is the Shamrock Summit is where they began discussions around the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which was later ratified in 1988 after the 88 election. But the Prime Minister has been involved in numerous major trade negotiations. And when we do our video on Canadian trade history, I will walk you through these events. So we have John A. Macdonald's national policy, which set up a very large tariff wall to protect Canadian businesses. Wilfrid Laurier negotiated the Reciprocity Treaty in 1911. And just as in 88, there was an election on that, and Laurier lost, and so we went back to trade protection. What is interesting about that is in the 19th and much of the 20th century, the Liberal Party was the party of free trade. The Conservatives were the party of trade protection. This flip-flopped in 88 when Mulroney negotiated the free trade agreement with the United States and later NAFTA. It was strongly opposed by the Liberals, led at that time by John Turner. And so the parties switched. Today, both the Conservatives and the Liberals believe in free trade. The opponent in the House of Commons is now the NDP. But it wasn't just Macdonald and Laurier. Mackenzie King helped negotiate the Imperial Preferences Agreement in the mid-1930s, as well as GATT, which occurred just after World War II. John Diefenbaker had this idea about diversifying trade to the rest of the Commonwealth and away from the United States. It didn't work very well. Pierre Trudeau, after the Nixon shocks of 1971, introduced the concept of the third option. And again, I'll go into that in more detail in the history section. I've already talked about Mulroney and the US trade agreement. When Jean Chrétien and the Liberals came to power, his idea was trade promotion outside of the United States. And so he would gather business leaders and premiers and go to India or go to Germany or go to China. Stephen Harper's government negotiated the CETA agreement with the European Union and the initial negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Justin Trudeau was involved in the renegotiation of NAFTA, as well as the renegotiation of the TPP, which eventually became the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Global Affairs Canada is where trade is situated. This is a photo of Mary Ng. She is Canada's current trade minister, and you can see her whole title is listed there. I'm going to read off sections of her mandate letter. A mandate letter is a letter that the Prime Minister sends to each minister outlining the key priorities of the government as well as the key priorities for each minister. These are now publicly available. She is to work with multiple departments, and you can see working with innovation, science, and economic development, as well as with her partners in Global Affairs Canada, like the foreign minister. Core goal is export promotion, particularly small businesses. Often it's only large businesses that are involved in international trade, and the Canadian government has wanted more medium-sized and small businesses to also trade. She's to lead the implementation of CETA as well as the CPTPP. Increased support by the fact that Canada is the only G7 country with a trade agreement with every other G7 country. So CETA includes all of our European partners, NAFTA includes the United States, and the CPTPP is with Japan. Again, as I mentioned, working with small and medium-sized enterprises for exports. Working with the Minister of Agriculture about getting Canadians' agricultural products into global markets, whether that's pork, beef, canola, seafood. Again, small, medium-sized companies facing commercial or trade disputes. Working on a trade diversification strategy. This has always been a goal going back multiple decades of trying to diversify our trade away from the United States. A series of other organizations to work with, pursue new trade agreements, and also work at the WTO around reform. This is an important part. So support the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. That's Chrystia Freeland. She is now the Finance Minister, but Freeland holds the Canada-US file wherever she goes, and we'll talk about Ms. Freeland in a moment. This is Francois Philippe Champagne. He is a former trade minister, but now the foreign minister. And obviously, he plays an important role in international trade. And from a cabinet perspective, is more important than just the trade minister. This is Ms. Freeland. So she is Canada's former trade minister. Then she became foreign minister. Then she became intergovernmental affairs minister, but as well as deputy prime minister. But wherever she has gone, she has retained the Canada-US file. So she was involved as a trade minister with the NAFTA renegotiation. When there was a cabinet shuffle and she went to foreign affairs, she was kept that file. When she went to intergovernmental affairs, she kept that file. And even though NAFTA has now been ratified, is in force, she continues to hold Canada-US relations as part of her. This is unique in Canadian history, that you would have one individual maintaining a portfolio no matter which department that she led. So as I mentioned, the rest of Global Affairs Canada, besides the ministers, are the various bureaucrats and diplomats that work for GAC. They have trade commissions working with Canadian companies to sell their product. As I mentioned, EDC and CCC are crown corporations, again, designed to support Canadian companies. So, for example, EDC provides credit insurance, bonding, political risk insurance, as well as loans, making it much easier to try to go to a new market. There's two types of accounts. There's the corporate account, which is administered by the EDC. The Canada account has to go through cabinet, and that is for the largest contracts or the most politically sensitive contracts. The Canadian Commercial Corporation also provides financing for exports. The Department of Finance has an international trade policy division, and it brings Canada's domestic policies into line with the various international treaties that we have signed. So it rules on tariffs, it rules on rules of origin, it deals with trade remedies, and the like. This isn't just with products, it also looks at trade and services, competition policy, labor standards, e-commerce. Other departments are also involved. Revenue Canada collects tariffs. Industry Canada deals with investment issues, which will be the subject of a subsequent video. Bank of Canada deals with currency transactions, exchange rates, monetary issues. That has an impact on trade. And various other departments also are involved in trade. We've already mentioned agriculture, for example. The Canadian International Trade Tribunal is part of the Department of Finance, and it does the judicial interpretation of the rules for both companies operating in Canada from abroad or Canadian companies. This is an example of its mandate, as well as hearing appeals of decisions from the Canadian Customs and Revenue Agency. Now, the provinces, constitutionally negotiating, ratifying trade agreements is in federal jurisdiction, but the implementation of trade agreements can also involve areas of provincial jurisdiction. The Labor Conventions case of 1937 established the precedent that Ottawa could negotiate international treaties, but it didn't have the right to implement agreements in areas of provincial jurisdiction without the approval of the provinces. Subsequent court decisions over the last several decades have reinforced that there's a balance in trade policy between the federal government and the provincial government. This has led to some constitutional ambiguity. Provinces have their own economic interests. They have created provincial trade offices around the world. They've pursued cross-border linkages with American states. They go on some of those trade summits that Jean Chrétien organized. And they all have, because Canada is such a large, diverse country, their own provincial interests. So here in Alberta, we're focused on cattle. We're focused on oil and gas exports. If it was Ontario, it'd be the auto sector. If it was Quebec, the dairy boards and the aluminum sector. Atlantic Canada, fishing and lobster. BC, the lumber, and there's been numerous disputes over softwood lumber with the United States. Here's just some examples from Alberta. We have 12 international trade offices around the world, not just in the United States, but a lot in Asia and some in Europe. And the goal is to work with the Canadian government. And often these offices are in our embassies and consulates, but it's to focus on Alberta's interests, which may be separate from the broader Canadian interest. Premiers and other cabinet ministers from Alberta will often make international trade visits, just as the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers do. Here's just some examples of the activities that they do. And here's some photos. So this is Team Canada Trade Mission. There's Jean Chrétien with a couple ministers and cabinet officials and premiers when they went to Europe in 2002. The photo on the top left is the Western provinces and the Western U.S. states. This was timed during the Stelmach government. He is focused right there in the middle. This is a photo of Alison Redford meeting the former Speaker of the House in Washington. This was our Washington trade rep, Dave Bronconnier, the former mayor of Calgary. You'll often see that the trade representatives that Alberta puts in place are not career bureaucrats. They're often ex-politicians that have a direct connection back to the premier. A couple other interesting photos. So there was a major battle over cattle, where the United States in the early 2000s shut off the border to Alberta cattle because there was some diseased cattle. This is Ralph Klein trying to open the border. This is Alison Redford below. speaking in Beijing, promoting Alberta trade. Here's a photo of Rachel Notley going to New York to meet with investors to invest in Alberta. This is an infamous photo of Ed Stelmach in Washington trying to promote Alberta's oil and gas sector, and you can tell that there are protesters dressed up as polar bears that don't appreciate that. And this led to a major battle, for example, over the Keystone XL pipeline. More recently, this is a picture of current Premier Jason Kenney with a handful of other premiers, Scott Moe of Saskatchewan, Doug Ford of Ontario, meeting in Washington to help promote Canadian trade. And this is our current representative in Washington. James Rajotte is a former Conservative MP, closely associated with Jason Kenney. So again, that reflects the political interests as much as the bureaucratic interests that our trade offices have. The provinces have had unofficial briefings. So during the Tokyo round of GATT, Ottawa would brief provincial governments. During the negotiations of the Canada-US agreement, Alberta and other provinces demanded a seat at the negotiating table because what Alberta was concerned about was oil and gas exports. This led to a formalization of negotiations where the provinces were consulted and briefed the federal negotiators. So the provinces weren't at the negotiating table, but the federal government would spend an awful lot of time working and taking into account the various interests of the provincial governments. And this was over the Canada-US agreement. You can see just how often that they met. This enhanced the capacity to do trade policy in the provinces, and it also led to an expectation that has been largely fulfilled over the last 30 years that the provinces would take on greater and greater responsibilities. Same thing happened in NAFTA, and now there are regular meetings with the federal trade minister and various provincial trade ministers. In negotiations with the European Union over CETA, the provinces also played a role. What were they concerned about? Well, they wanted to protect their liquor control boards, where they have a monopoly in each province. Ontario and Quebec wanted to protect their marketing boards for dairy, poultry, and eggs. And the provinces wanted to ensure government procurement would be restricted to Canadian companies in a whole host of sectors. The provinces push for specific language, they push for outcomes, and the federal government, because they need the support of the provinces to implement these agreements, and some of them, as I said, are in provincial jurisdiction, will respond in kind. Now, civil society. So much of what I've talked about is politicians and bureaucrats, and that's the way it was done. But since the 1990s, there has been more of an opening up of Canadian trade policy to include business groups and non-governmental actors. And the reason for that is the amount of trade has substantially increased. The whole concept of globalization and the dominance of market economies has made it more important to domestic actors. Trade policy has gone beyond simple tariffs to include a whole suite of non-tariff barriers, trade and services, intellectual property rights, investment, and therefore is infringing more and more into domestic jurisdiction. Therefore, actors within domestic society want to become more and more involved in trade policy. The WTO, with its more successful dispute settlement mechanism, is a more effective institution than GATT. Therefore, people pay more attention to the WTO than they ever did to GATT. Regional organizations, whether it's NAFTA or the European Union, have stronger powers. Chris, in a previous video, talked about the role of Chapter 11, the investment protection chapter in NAFTA. So what we're seeing is some tensions as trade policy institutions like the WTO, like the European Union, like NAFTA have become more important. Therefore, actors want to have more leverage over these institutions. So, Global Affairs Canada, as they have been doing for decades with the provinces, has increased its public consultation process. So, for example, those in Alberta may remember in 2002, the G8 summit was held in Kananaskis. There was a separate group of societal actors that called themselves the G6B, the group of 6 billion, and they were protesting a large number. They were protesting the summit, not realizing that they were actually being funded by the government of Canada. The Doha Development Agenda, Global Affairs Canada held roundtables right across the country to get input from academics, from societal groups, from business groups, etc. Same thing occurred with the Canada-India economic package. So I actually got to attend one of these consultations because I had done some work on Canadian-India nuclear relations. And there was everyone else in the room was part of the Indian diaspora or had some sort of company that had business interests in India. Now, critics like Naomi Klein argue that trade negotiations and agreements contain fences, and these are actual physical fences, but they're also virtual fences. And these are some photos of the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City. There was a time period where every time there was a major international meeting around trade, that there would be large-scale demonstrations against them. And so the fences were put up to protect the negotiators from the protesters. Okay. But Klein goes further than this and says it's not just the real fences, but there's also virtual fences that protect companies' intellectual property rights or NAFTA's Chapter 11. And I'll just give you one example from the Quebec City Summit. There was a large reception that was held for all of the leaders of the countries of North America and South America. And it was sponsored by the Bank of Montreal. And so the Bank of Montreal executives would intermingle and have some champagne and hors d'oeuvres with the Prime Minister of the United States, or sorry, the President of the United States, or the President of Mexico, the President of Chile. And Chrétien was asked about this, and he said, look, anybody could fund this reception. The protesters outside could fund this reception, or the Bank of Montreal could. And I mean, that's a bit ridiculous. It is clear that a major Canadian company is going to have more resources than a civil society organization. And so the question that Klein poses is, what groups are inside the fences? What groups are outside the fences? And another criticism is that consultations have the appearance of giving a voice to civil society, but the question is, who does government really listen to? So that is a brief overview of the various actors involved in Canadian trade policy. Their influence is going to depend on which agreement we're looking at. And this is why when we look at subsequent videos that walk through some of the history of these major agreements, you'll get a sense of the interaction of actors. So stay tuned for the rest of the videos under Canadian trade policy. Thank you.